Jackman?
I have a very unstable connection. I'm not hearing very much at all.
Okay, I'll see what we can do.
And but not everybody's microphones are turned on, so I think that's part of it. Did you just hear me, Rex?
No, he's not. And Jurdy?
Here. Okay, and we're going to recess as the Regional Transportation Planning Agency and reconvene as the Policy Advisory Committee. First item on the agenda is public expression. Members of the public are welcome to comment on items that are not on the agenda. We also have multiple items on the agenda where you're welcome to comment. Do we have any members of the public who would like to address the board on non-agenda items?
And I do have one quick announcement I want to make before we move on also.
Okay.
So we have learned that this will be Marta's last MCOG meeting. She's relocating out of the area to be closer to family, and so we just want to take a minute to thank her for all of her hard work and for serving the MCOG board, and wish her well in her future endeavors.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marta.
Thank you. I'll miss the board.
Okay, thank you. So, and we'll go on to regular calendar, which is acceptance and presentation of the zero emissions vehicle. And I don't know if there are a few comments that staff would like to make to
Yes.
open this up.
Yes, I'd like to give a brief report. Good afternoon. Today we have the representatives from WTrans, the consultant conducting the zero emission vehicle and alternative fuels readiness plan update, with us to give a presentation. And just to give you a brief review, as reported at last month's meeting, the current work program contains a project to update the ZEV plan. And the ZEV plan was first developed in fiscal year 2012-13, and then we had a follow-up feasibility study in 2014-15. So the purpose of this project is to update and revise the existing plan to reflect changes that have occurred in the past 5 years, and to integrate recent alternative fuels interregional planning into the document. The project's funded with state RPA funds. The total budget was $54,000, a fairly small project. RPA funds are good for 1 year, and we had to go through 2 competitive RFP processes because the first process resulted in no proposals. So the consultant really only had about 6 months. By the time we got started and got under contract, the consultant had less than 6 months to complete the project. And the project was a ZEV advisory group, a ZAG that we called it, worked with the consultant throughout the project, met regularly, and had input into the development of the plan. And I particularly want to point out Janet's efforts. She greatly contributed to the project with her wealth of knowledge. And so the project's now nearly complete. The consultant's here to give you a PowerPoint presentation. We have 1 copy of the draft circulating. After the plan is accepted, we'll be happy to make print copies upon request. It's been posted to the MCOG website for a good while in advance of this meeting. And so I think before the consultant makes his presentation, Janet wanted to make some remarks.
Oh, hi, thank you. So we're really pleased to bring this readiness plan to you today. I'm kind of excited about it. The zero emissions landscape is changing rapidly, and so our plan was already 5 years out of date before we knew it. And we saw the need to do the update. When I first had the idea, my boss, my colleagues all encouraged me to write that proposal, and I pitched it to the Technical Advisory Committee. Everybody's been really supportive, and I appreciate that. And as Loretta mentioned, we fully thought we'd have at least a year to work on this, and it came down to the consultants only had a few months, and they've just done a fantastic job in that compressed amount of time. And I believe they're the perfect team to do what we wanted to get done, and had just the right expertise for this project. So it's been great working with Barry and Nick and Steve Weinberger, the principal of that firm. And also I'd like to express appreciation to the ZEV advisory group. We affectionately call it the ZAG, and for all their participation and their time and input. So I just wanted to take time to thank everyone involved for all their support on this project, and we hope to continue with a longer term effort toward implementation over time. And after the presentation, I will have just a couple of comments and requests for the plan. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I guess we'll hear from W-Trans.
Good afternoon. I'm Barry Bergman with W-Trans. I also wanted to introduce my colleague, Nick Leach. Nick did a lot of work on this project as well. And yeah, we're real excited to be here. This is a really interesting project. As Janet said, this is an area that's changing really rapidly, and even though the other plan was only a few years old, there's a lot of things in the works, and hopefully this is something that just has to be, planning has to be kind of ongoing just to kind of keep pace with where things are at. So I'm going to provide first a little bit of kind of context as where things are at and where we're going, and I'm going to try to move through that pretty quickly so that I can spend a little more time on kind of the meat of the recommendations in the plan. So what's driving electric vehicle charger planning? The state has very ambitious greenhouse gas emission reduction goals, a lot of which are transportation related, and the statewide goals for 5 million zero emission vehicles by 2030 and 250,000 charging stations by 2025. Loretta had mentioned a little bit about a couple of the plans that were done previously. So MCOG has really taken a leading role in this over the years. The two plans at the bottom there are, the ones at the top are more about electric vehicles, and then the last two are more alternative fuels more broadly. So the Northwest Alternative Fuels Readiness Plan includes electric vehicles as well as other fuels, and then the one at the bottom is fuel cells. So fuel cells plus electric vehicles together are the zero emission vehicles. So the goals of the current update: we wanted to identify a core network of charging stations, and I'm going to explain a bit more about that later, so I'll just go down the rest of the list here. But to support and encourage development of charging stations at various destinations around the county, to come up with policies and regulations that local agencies and the county can do to help support the further development of charging infrastructure, establish a mechanism for ongoing coordination and collaboration, and then support further regional efforts to do alternative fuels planning. So what are the challenges to expanding electric vehicle use? There are kind of three main things. In the past, the cost of electric vehicles has been a big barrier to a lot of people, and limited range, and then what they call range anxiety. So the limited range combined with the limited number of fueling stations, people are just concerned about being left in the middle of nowhere without any charge. But a lot of that has been changing. Just in the last 6 years, well, 2010 to 2016, 77% drop in the cost of batteries. And at the same time, the range of the batteries is increasing. So if you look back at 2015, other than Tesla, all the vehicles on this list had under 100 miles of range. By 2019, they're all over 100, and the average went from 119 to 190, and that's continuing to increase. So we're seeing both of those trends: reducing price, increase of range. The next 5 years is going to be a big change from what we see today. And then the question of availability of public charging stations. So we've got a few questions we're looking at with that. One, where are the stations located? How much geographic area is covered? How much space, how many miles are between them? How is the access restricted? And then the number of chargers relative to the demand. So, you know, one charger in Kovlo versus one charger in Ukiah is going to have a very different meaning as far as the amount of demand and number of people looking to use it. Janet and Loretta, I think, mentioned about the Zero Emissions Vehicle Advisory Group. So we had the local jurisdictions represented, other agencies as well. We had a representative of ChargePoint, one of the charging networks that is represented in this area, Caltrans. So just a little bit about charging in general. They use a pyramid to kind of describe how that works, where people tend to charge, and the majority of charging is done at home and work, which makes a lot of sense. People can charge while they're sleeping or while they're working, and you can get a large block of time. And so for this plan, we really focused more on charging in public areas. So it might be shopping destinations, places where people are going to be for maybe a few hours at a time, and where they can charge when they're in the middle of the day running errands or out somewhere. So I mentioned before the core network. So one of the ideas was to minimize range anxiety, so to make sure that the spacing of the stations is sufficient to alleviate those kinds of concerns. We were generally looking at about 25 miles per spacing, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute. We wanted to make sure that this network served the broadest possible number of users. And I'd say the idea was not to make this the place where most people can get most of their charging done. It was really kind of a safety net. So when people are out in the world, they need their charging, as I said, most charging will be done at home. This way, they won't have that worry about being stranded.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Go back to the previous slide. So when a car is getting charged at the public area, level 1 or 2, the fast charge, how long is that?
You're one step ahead of me.
Oh, okay.
So there's 3 different chargers. I'll explain when I get to the map
Okay.
because it'll be a little bit clearer. I can fit into what I'm talking about. So we're looking at minimizing the issue of range anxiety. As far as serving the broadest possible number of users, we wanted to stick with open standard chargers. So what that really is referring to is a lot of the chargers that have been installed in recent years around here are put in by Tesla, which is great if you're a Tesla user. And so if you're looking to figure out where you can charge and you don't own a Tesla, there's a lot of those chargers on that map that you're not actually going to be able to use. So in thinking about what could be kind of that safety net for most people, we wanted to be able to include things that most people could use. So ones that have that are usable by any electric vehicle, and also ones that are not required, where you're not required to be a customer of a business. A lot of these charges are also done at hotels, at B&Bs, and so if you're not a guest at one of these places, then that may not be something that's going to be helpful for you. And again, help address the relative demand for charging stations. So in places where we're anticipating that there's more demand, larger, more activity, then to have more stations in place. I'm not going to talk much about this, but you may have heard of DC fast chargers. So this is something that requires a lot less time. The focus on DC fast chargers, which are quite a bit more expensive, they require a lot more power, so they're really not practical to install everywhere. So usually on these interregional routes, when people are traveling long distances, they don't want to be stopping for very long. So I just put a little circle here where the Mendocino County chargers are. You can see it's part of a much larger network that is being planned from Mexico up to Canada. So Highway 101 is one of those main corridors. And this is the kind of connectivity, the kind of reach you can get by using those chargers. You might be able to see there's a few small dots, which are the DC chargers on the 101 corridor. There's also one along 128. But a 1 hour charging time provides an estimated 100 miles of range. So even though there's only a few chargers around, you can cover pretty much, you can get to any place in the county. But there will be other chargers you can use for shorter distances, and that's what I'm going to show you in a second. So the question of range. 1 hour gives you approximately 22 miles of charge on a level 2 charger. And level 2 chargers are the most common ones that are used for public chargers. Level 1s are really slow, and that's basically if you plug into an outlet at your home, that's equivalent of a level 1 charger. So you really have to charge it all night. So if you see there's an orange buffer that shows where someone could travel from the existing chargers, the public chargers, given that they've charged for 1 hour. So where can you go and come back without being stranded? The gray area is if you had 2 hours of charging time and how far you'd be able to cover. So you can see there's a lot of the county that is covered geographically by the existing chargers, but there's a big gap up in the northern part of the county, mostly around Laytonville, Covelo, some of the lower populated areas. And so we wanted to look at what are the things we could do as one of the things to address that. And the other issue, aside from the geographic coverage, is capacity. This is obviously not a Mendocino County scene, but it kind of illustrates the point. There's a large block of Teslas. We see vehicles waiting in line to charge. This is probably an extreme example. I think it was in Southern California on Thanksgiving weekend. But that is the kind of thing we could come across at some point. And so just to look at, well, where do we want to be able to locate additional chargers? Where is that capacity needed? So we took a look at where the larger cities are in Mendocino County, how the population is distributed, how the jobs are distributed, and then where vehicles are registered. So both on the right, there's all vehicles, then battery electric vehicles, and then the plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. So, and it seems that there's a pretty close correlation between the way that jobs are distributed and the battery electric vehicles. So the battery electric vehicles are solely reliant on charging, while the plug-in hybrids also run on gas. They have probably 20 to 50 miles of electric charge, and the rest of it is all on gas. So the battery electric ones are the ones that are really more vulnerable and more in need of the charging stations. But because Ukiah has a pretty large percentage of the county's jobs, there's a lot more activity during the day. You can see that when you look at the county share of the population, 68% of the people live outside of the incorporated areas, but most of those people are charging home. So when we have the public chargers, we want to put it in places of more activity. So we wanted to look at what exists compared to what the demand might be. So the column on the left there, the existing open access level 2 chargers. Open access, again, that excludes the Tesla chargers. It excludes ones where you need to be the customer of a business. So out of the 44 that currently exist, only 4 of them are in Ukiah. When you add in the Teslas and the ones from hotels and other kinds of businesses, there's 6 more out of additional 31. So out of a total 75 existing public chargers, we have 10 in Ukiah, which is significantly lower percentage-wise than the jobs that are here and the percentage of electric vehicles that are registered here. The column there where it says public level 2 chargers 2025 goal, that number is based on a model from the California Energy Commission. They did a study with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory to come up with an estimate of how many chargers we could expect to have in California and by county by 2025 to meet the state's goal, one that reflects the way people actually behave and what they would need. So they came up with a total of 150 public level 2 chargers by 2025. And if we think about, wanting to match the employment breakdown, that would be about 50 in Ukiah. So you can see that if we're looking to move toward that goal, that Ukiah in particular has a longer way to go, and that's a place to target more of the investments to meet the demand.
I have a question on this.
Sure.
Did you contact the people who are running the chargers right now to find out who's actually using them? Because obviously we have the number of electric vehicle owners who live in the county who are using the chargers, but we also have people who are traveling into our county who are using the chargers. Right. So do we know if the residents using the chargers constitute 100% or 10% of the people who are using the chargers? Because it could be that the chargers are predominantly used by people who don't live in Mendocino County.
Yeah, I mean, that might be something to talk to, because a lot of that is proprietary data. I guess some of them are publicly owned, so I'm not sure if there's data around that. What we were looking at was that a lot of the ones that are the public stations, but for example linked to businesses, the Route 1 corridor is pretty well covered. There's actually a pretty large chunk of the public chargers are in Fort Bragg. I think Mendocino may have more chargers than any other community in the county.
It may also get more tourists than any other community.
Right, exactly.
In the county.
No, I think that's exactly the point. And one of the things is that right now there really isn't a good business model for chargers. It's not something that's generating much of a profit in many places at this point. I think especially in a rural community, but in a place where you've got a tourist business, they see that as a way to draw customers in, as a way to make them stand out. It's just an amenity they can offer to people. So it seems like even though the chargers themselves aren't generating money, the market is to some degree taking care of the need for the tourist businesses. So our thinking was more to focus on places where the jobs were in Ukiah, where the local population is based, since that doesn't seem to be getting picked up at the moment. And again, that calculation could very easily change in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah. Several questions that I have. First of all, I know virtually nothing about electric, okay, so you're gonna have to start from basic with me. But you can't, if you have a regular car that's electric and it's not a Tesla, you can't charge on a Tesla charger?
That's correct.
So somewhere along the line, Tesla has made charging stations along the state of California, which they figure their cars from Oregon border to San Diego are gonna be traveling.
Yeah, I mean, they have their own network. I mean, and I would say also the converse, Tesla vehicles can charge on other kinds of chargers.
But you can't, if you have another,
You can't
whatever it
use a
is, you
Tesla.
can't charge
Right.
on theirs.
It's a proprietary plug.
Okay,
Yep.
and so how far, if I was starting in the Oregon border and I wanted to go to San Diego, how long would it take me to get to San Diego?
How fast you driving?
I'm driving just like everybody else,
No, I'm
65,
kidding.
70 miles an hour.
They, I mean, well, with if you stick with the major highway corridors and those DC fast charging networks along Route 101 or along Route 5, it depends on the range of your car. The Tesla vehicles, they get over 300 miles once your battery is fully charged. So there's the time to fully charge it, and then we said one hour will get you about 100 miles. I'm not sure if Teslas charge faster than that. Do you know?
It would take about an hour and a half to your trip.
Okay, so an hour and a half for the entire trip, you're saying? Okay, so there you go. So it add an hour and a half to your normal driving trip that otherwise just by fueling at gas stations.
That would be overall, I mean, if I can travel from Oregon border to, let's say, in 14 or 15 hours or whatever it takes to drive, all I have to do for an electric car is just add another hour and a half to it?
Well, it will depend on
I'm
different
going
vehicles.
down Highway 5. I
Yeah,
mean,
different vehicles have different capacity. So there are some electric vehicles might only have a 100-mile battery, and whereas a Tesla has 300 miles. So then you've got to obviously stop more frequently.
I'm just, you
It's
know,
getting a lot closer to be comparable to a gasoline vehicle than it was even 5 years ago.
okay, I understand that, but I'm a local person, and I know one person that has a electric car that drove it back and forth from home to work. But with my places that I go, I'm gonna be in Ukiah quite a bit just for charging. Because, you know, if I go over to Fort Bragg, I try not to go to Fort Bragg, but that's, anyhow, that is, I can't understand unless they really improve the batteries, how this is gonna really work for the average person.
I think it is more challenging in a rural area because the distances can be long, and especially if you're riding on rough terrain, you could have a lower amount of miles available per charge. But if I look at the map, I mean, this is the existing chargers here. All of those black dots represent existing public charging stations. So you can see there are some in Ukiah, there are in Willits, there's quite a bit along the coast in Fort Bragg and Mendocino. So you can charge in Ukiah, you can recharge again in Fort Bragg if you need to. You know,
And I'm
depending
not
on
trying to
the,
give you a bad time, I'm just trying to
Sure.
figure it
No,
out, honest. I'm not saying, you know, that, because I think it's a great idea, it's just that to do away with gasoline versus this, you know, in 20 years, I mean, I won't be around, but, I mean, somebody will be around that is gonna be making this decision. You know, and then if I wanna go to Covelo and back, I can't, is there a charging station in Covelo?
no, that's, you're one step ahead of me. Because what we're doing is recommending some additional chargers, one of which would be Covelo. So the one I was just showing the existing, we had recommended some additional charging stations to close some of those gaps, and then also to add capacity in places like Ukiah and in Willits. And so when we've added those in, then again, that orange area shows if you have 1 hour worth of charge from one of those stations. The gray area is if you have 2 hours where you've charged. And now you can get out to Covelo, now you can go to Laytonville. You filled in a lot of those gaps.
And the gold area or yellow area that goes across, is that Highway 20?
Yes.
So there's some around the lakes that,
There's one location recommended right in the middle there. And,
mentioned the lakes.
is that Jackson, yeah, Jackson's demonstration forest?
He mentioned the lake, so I think he meant
Oh, I'm
Lake
sorry.
County, toward Lake County.
Oh, Lake County. There is, I know there's, I think there's a Tesla one over in Lake County. But you can see it goes over to Clear Lake, that reach. Lake County actually does not have a whole lot of chargers. That's one of the challenges also, is you rely on what are they doing in other jurisdictions, because you want to have that interconnected network beyond county lines. So Humboldt County is doing quite a bit. Sonoma County is doing quite a bit. Lake County has some, but yeah, that'll be more of a hindrance in that direction. Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up a lot of really good points. We're really in a transition period right now, and we're at a point where, for some people, this kind of vehicle makes sense depending on what they do on a day-to-day basis. For other people, probably not quite yet.
Tess?
I have a question. For some of us with hybrids, we have gas as a backup, and after we use up our miles, we just say, oh, well. But for those with 100% electrical, like a Volt or something like that, I'm not talking about Tesla. I've always thought that it makes more sense to have government-controlled batteries where you would pull into a service station and they already have a charged government battery ready for you, and you just trade them out and you pay, and you don't touch your battery. Basically, they just trade them out for you. Is there anything like that on the horizon that you know of?
We were kind of talking about that on the way up here, actually. Dick, do you know anything about it?
A little bit, yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nick Bleach. I'm an associate at W-Trans. In a previous life, I was a senior advisor at the U.S. Department of Energy, working on advanced vehicle adoption, so a bit of a technical expert here in this field. Battery swap is a thing that is coming at some point on the larger, the heavy-duty side for fleet use. That's a type of battery function that works really well if you have a hub and spoke system for deliveries. You can swap them out really quickly. On the private vehicle side, the battery packs are actually really small, comparable to like a larger vehicle, so they're actually harder to remove because they're more ingrained in the vehicle. They're trying to work on aerodynamics and on other features of the car, so the packs are built around a lot of things as opposed to a large truck that has more chassis space to attach a battery to. So on a passenger vehicle, it's a little more difficult to swap a battery, but for the heavy duty side, that is what they're working towards.
Well, I don't think, we're not ready for prime time just yet, but what I was thinking was that when this becomes a thing that is offered or demanded by government or whatever, that the car manufacturers will build that in so that they could be swapped out with a special key or... Yeah,
and along those same lines, to answer Larry's question about sort of vehicle fleet makeup, the U.S. government, EPA, NHTSA, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, have adopted and continue to adopt the corporate average fuel economy standards. Those are the governing regulations for fuel economy going into the future. It's a fleet-wide average for each vehicle manufacturer, so everyone's picking a separate path. So we're not going to lose any one fuel type as electricity comes along. Each manufacturer gets their sort of choice to meet how they build their pie. It can be any sort of way to get there. So electric vehicles are a great way to get to that side, but there's also a lot of changes happening with gasoline and hybridization on that front. So it's sort of a trade-off as the time goes along, and something may come along like that where someone may get more involved. The auto manufacturers are getting more involved in their own development of charging networks, not only Tesla, Volkswagen through the Dieselgate litigation measures are currently developing their network for the Volkswagen Group vehicles, so that's Volkswagen and Audi. They use an open proprietary plug standard as well. And GM just announced last week that they're also working towards developing their own charging network. So as aside from the battery sort of, and Chevron has announced they want to start putting them in at their gas stations, and so there's a lot of, the snowball is rolling. So whether it's swappable batteries or what, the manufacturers are getting on board with this because they're seeing the demand and they know if they want to sell to a large majority of America a large truck or an SUV, then they need to balance. It's the pie, right? They need to get to a tipping point. So they're trying to think about how to target the areas where the electric vehicle makes sense The average, 95% of the average commuting distance in America is 40 miles, which is well within the range without having to charge any modern electric vehicle. So like we were talking about here, focusing on Ukiah, where there are residents who work and make a sort of typical suburban commute, which is much less than 40 miles. It makes sense to own an EV, and you can get down to the places you want to go. But it may not make sense for someone in Laytonville or Leggett, or someone who's driving all the way into Ukiah every day. They may still want that gasoline car. But there's sort of a tipping point right now where we're seeing this come, and so we're seeing how to make this network accessible for all those users, while from a public side, and the private side will come along and it's going to backfill. It's sort of like the gas station model as well. So eventually they'll start popping up in different places as the demand grows.
Thank you. John?
Yes, thank you. So the county of Mendocino is looking at moving to, electric vehicles. And so is there a tipping point where it's economically viable to have your own charging station for a certain number of vehicles at, the fleet yard?
Yeah, if we're looking at the fleet yard, if you have one electric vehicle, one charging station will save you money. Especially if you're using for fleet use, you can charge them overnight. You can have a one level 2 charger that you might use during the day. For example, if someone comes in with a low battery and they would like to recharge so they can get that extra 50, 60 miles of range, maybe they come in for lunch and they've been driving around all morning and they want to go out in the afternoon again. Or you can use the level 1 chargers, which are a normal 120 plug, and you can plug them in overnight, and by the time you get back in the morning, the car will be charged. So it makes great sense for fleet use to have maybe one level 2 and a bunch of level 1s on site, and then you can sort of flip through the system, so you can move cars when they're full, especially on a fleet side. It's a lot easier to move someone out of a charger if the car is already charged, as opposed to if I'm at a grocery store and someone's just sitting there parked for too long after the car is full, right? So fleet is a great implementation for EVs or even plug-in hybrids that have a longer range.
So what is the cost for the level 2?
So it depends on the infrastructure and sort of what the availability is. They range anywhere from $1,000 to just if the plug is ready and the wiring is there to more than that, depending on how far you need to run wiring. But in a fleet yard, there's usually availability of electricity. You have electricians on staff in a county here. It's easy to access those sort of things. So it's not too expensive if the infrastructure is already there, because a level 2 charger runs on a 240 volt fuse. So it's equivalent to a washing machine or a dryer, or an electric range. They use a 240 plug as opposed to 120 volts. So you just need an extra fuse and then run the wiring.
Yeah, and if I could just add one more thing. Yeah. With Larry's question about starting from the Oregon border down to San Diego, it just seems like if there's a 22-mile range per hour of charge, and you go 200 miles, whatever it is, 700 miles or something between, and you go the first 200 miles, then after that, you have to get an hour of charge for every 22 miles.
So as Barry had mentioned, that we looked at what are called DC direct current fast chargers. So since we're sort of new to the electric vehicle infrastructure, as we've mentioned here, the 3 levels of charging: DC fast chargers, level 2, and level 1. Level 2 and level 1 chargers provide alternating current electricity from the power grid. And then on board, a charger converts that AC power to DC power. Batteries run on DC power. So you have to convert it from alternating current to direct current energy. And that's done on board with a level 1 and a level 2 charger, because they're plugged into the energy grid. So that's the limiting factor, is how fast the charger on the car can convert that energy. Now, a DC fast charger already converts your alternating current energy into direct current inside of the charger itself. So then you're directly flowing direct current energy from the charger, from the grid to the car. So you bypass the limitation of the charger. A converter of that size is large. A DC fast charger is bigger than this podium, like this by like this, because it requires a lot of conversion power, and they draw a lot of power. They run on 480 volts, so commercial grade power. And so they're providing you direct current. So while you can get an hour, gives you 100 miles, that's an average fast charger. That's a normal draw. Tesla superchargers can provide 80% of the range of the vehicle, so over 200 miles in 30 minutes. So it depends on your power draw, but a problem with those in a rural county is that your electricity generation is typically priced on the peak demand of the month. So you're going to jump tiers when you have a spike during one specific time, and those draw a lot of power. So that's the downside to a DC fast charger in a rural area, is that they pull a lot of power really fast to charge up that battery really quickly. So it can be very expensive to own and operate one of those. So that's why Tesla, with their network, are paying for them and owning them themselves and taking that cost in, as opposed to sending it directly onto the consumer like you might have to do with a non-Tesla charger.
Thank you.
Yep.
We have
more-
another question here.
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead.
I have one question about the Willis to Laytonville. I thought that they were already installing chargers in Laytonville.
There are DC fast chargers planned, so that's the intercorridor work. We're looking at the level 2 sort of range anxiety limiting chargers here. And this was a site that was identified in the previous studies in 2013 and then reviewed again in 2015. So we've carried it forward here as part of the continuation of the planning process. There's a separate effort for those inter-regional trips in Laytonville.
Okay, so they are putting ones in, but not ones that affect the level 2 chargers.
Right, exactly, yep.
Thank you.
Yep.
I have one question. Not to put a damper on anything, because I'm very excited about all this. I just attended a CalCog meeting, and they talked about the new SAFE. EPA would basically abolish the rules and the incentives and all that, and they would come up with a whole different set of emission standards, and potentially they're saying that it would take away the money that's being spent or planned to be spent. Just wondering what your reaction to that is.
Yeah, so there has been talk from the current administration to an attempt to remove the corporate average fuel economy standards and roll back a number of the environmental protections that have been in place over the last 30 years since the EPA was founded. But a lot of those are acts of Congress or congressional rulemakings that have been adopted and would require an act of Congress to undo. They are publicly vetted federal laws and statutes, so it's can be suggested from that perspective, but in order to remove them, it would require an act of Congress. So it's a lot of speculation at this time, but until there's movement from that side, then everything stays in law as it was at the end of the previous administration.
Thanks.
Okay, I just had a couple more things I wanted to go through here. Am I doing okay? I know I'm probably running a little over. Is that all right? Okay. So just a few things I'm just going to mention quickly. In terms of policies and regulations, so this gets beyond looking at the core network and thinking about what can local agencies do in order to support the adoption, the implementation of the charging network more broadly. So this could be by employers at employment sites. It could be ways to encourage it as part of housing projects. So things like that. So the idea is that we don't want to be relying on the public sector to foot the bill for all of this. It's to put a process in place where there can be a lot of partnering between the public and the private sectors and share that responsibility. So one thing that the state has done is it passed AB 1236, which requires the streamlining of the permit process for vehicle chargers. So that's something a lot of jurisdictions have not yet been able to put in place, but that is there, and it's also something that would help a company like ChargePoint, which is developing a network, and that way, but they have to deal with multiple jurisdictions. So to have a more consistent, streamlined process can benefit the network as a whole. I think I bumped. There we go. And So then, the building code is also another place where changes can be made at the local level. Zoning to have charges as a permitted use. Parking requirements, for example, to have vehicle charging spaces count toward the required number of parking spaces. And agencies can do steps to electrify their fleets and help increase the demand. So there are things that may or may not be appropriate for different agencies, but they're worth looking at. We're including model regulations as part of the plan as a resource and places where people could find more information. And another thing, just to kind of keep ongoing, as we were saying, this fluid process, rapidly changing. Answers to some of these questions could look very different in 5 years, but to have some kind of an ongoing coordinating entity to help make sure that the county stays up to speed with what is happening. So we've talked about having a coordinating council. There has been something up further north in Humboldt County, and that's something that I think has not, it's one of the challenges that they have faced and that could be an issue here as well is having the resources to keep this going. It's not, everyone's always busy, got a million things doing, and so to have an ongoing entity in place is challenging. So one of the things to do is, but a lot of the functions that it could have is, to share best practices, make sure that planning is coordinated among jurisdictions within the county, across county lines, joint funding, applying for grants with multi-jurisdictions, to have kind of a regional process, to do a corridor level project where you can look across jurisdictional lines. Doing education and marketing to do outreach to employers, to shopping centers, places that may see a benefit in installing charging stations. I mean, Costco already has it, Target's doing it across the country. There's a lot of places that are possible locations. And so to deal with the issue of, are the resources available to have this ongoing entity, we've talked about the idea of trying to link to some existing multi-county planning efforts that are already underway. And one that we've thought is a good candidate for that could be the North State Super Region, where we have multiple rural counties banding together to focus on transportation issues. So this is something that would very nicely fit in with the mission of that group. And it could also just bring together a lot of staff from rural agencies that don't have that much capacity, but to be able to share their experiences and potentially work together to achieve mutually beneficial goals. So that is about all I covered. I'm sorry if I had to rush through some of it. There's a lot of little pieces to go through here. It's a big topic.
So I appreciate the recommendations that we could take back to our planning departments. Did you have a chance to review any of our existing ordinances to see if there are actually roadblocks, or do our ordinances already make it fairly simple?
Yeah, that's not something we were able to do as part of this.
Okay.
I mean, and it may be that there are things that, everyone's ordinances are a little bit different, and there may be some tweaks that can be made. The ones that we're including in the plan, there were a number of things that were cited by the Office of Planning and Research from the governor's office. The California building officials had something put together around the streamlining of the permitting process. So all of that we're putting in there, along with some links to websites because that stuff's being updated all the time.
John, go ahead.
Your recommendation about hooking into regional collaborative efforts, are there any happening right now between multiple counties or North Bay or?
Yeah, I mean, there are things. I mean, certainly like the Bay Area has but there's I think through, I don't know if it's through MTC or through the through ABAG, but they've got a multi-level, or probably the Air District. I mean, they all have the same 9-county area, and then but I mean, the reason we thought of the super region is that it's what is it, 16 counties? Is that right, Janet? So 16 counties in the northern part of the state. But I think the thing about that group is that it really focuses on lower density rural communities, and so the issues are more similar than if you're dealing with Oakland and if you're dealing with San Francisco, and especially when you're talking about the range anxiety kinds of issues. It's just, in Oakland you might have a station every few blocks, so it's a very different way of thinking about it. People's travel needs are different, so that's why we thought a group more focused on the needs of rural communities would be more appropriate.
So is this 16 county entity in existence right now?
Yes.
It is.
So I read most of your report. I didn't see the actual recommendations for the planning departments in there. But one thing that they've talked about at the Sonoma Clean Power meetings is that apparently to retrofit an apartment building, it's multiples of more expense than it is to just, when you build an apartment building, to include the charging station. So I don't know if you have those rough numbers. I mean, I think it's like 3 or 4 times more expensive. I don't know if.
Yeah, so it can be like orders of magnitude even more than that. It could be up to 10 times more expensive. One of the recommendations we've included is for the local jurisdictions to start adopting the optional measures in the Cal Green Building Code, which require new developments to the most expensive part of installing chargers into buildings is not the charger themselves. Those are pretty inexpensive in the grand scheme of things. You start running into large costs when you have to trench concrete or cut concrete or run conduit or expand breaker boxes to include more 240 volt breakers to run these chargers. So the Cal Green Building Code in the optional section, depending on the number of units, has a number of different levels. So the bigger the apartment complex, the more stringent it is. So I think if you have up to 10 units, make sure your breaker box has enough extra fuses for 2 chargers, and you run conduit before you pour concrete to 2 parking spaces. And then it gets progressively higher and higher after that. And then you get to a point where it requires you to start installing chargers, I think when you reach 100 units. And then you would install 2 chargers. And so that is definitely the most expensive cost, is the retrofitting depending on where your power is located. So it is much better to install it at the beginning. And that is I believe, a recommendation we have included, or at least a link in the end.
So then also, if a 120 volt would charge a car overnight,
Yep.
why would a residence need anything other than a level 1?
Because, so residents don't necessarily need more than level 1. So there's a couple different ways you could go about this sort of providing electricity. So all electric vehicles, when you buy them, come with a level 1 charger. It's a standard inclusion. So in your home, you could just plug it into the garage as long as it's a grounded outlet, and you'd be good to go. Some apartment complexes take the implementation of running, external conduit along the concrete wall and just putting a 120 volt at every parking space, and then you wouldn't have to worry about it being always occupied, right? So, but in an apartment building, if you only have a couple chargers, then a level 2 is good because you can make someone move. If they have an assigned spot, then they could go to the EV spot and charge, and then your HOA might make them move after 4 hours because your car will be fully charged in 4 hours, thereabouts. Those sort of things. So there's different approaches, but the Cal Green Building Code allows for those types of things.
Okay, so an alternate strategy could be you either put in a certain number of level 2s,
Yep.
or everybody has level 1 access.
Basically, yeah. And so, for example, and same goes with a workplace. So a workplace, your car is parked 8 hours. Level 1 charger gets you 5 miles per hour of charge. So if 95% of the commute in America is 40 miles, that covers 95% of everyone's commute. You no longer have a range anxiety concern because you come back to a full car if you have access to a charger. Coca-Cola in Atlanta implements that 1 plug per space mentality, and Atlanta had a really high tax break. Georgia did for a number of years, so a lot of people own EVs, and there are rows and rows and rows of EVs, and everyone brings their charger and plugs into the outlet. So it is a strategy that works both in the workplace and at home.
So you're saying you only get 5 miles per hour charging?
On level 1, yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's why it works at your house. You park overnight 12 hours, you park at the workplace 8 hours. You're looking to cover 95% of all daily travel in America.
Okay, but if you had a car that had battery capacity of 170 miles, you're not going to go from
empty to full overnight, no.
Okay, got it.
Which is why the level 2 might be beneficial in that case.
I need a class, I guess.
Yeah, there's a lot to understand. It's a very new technology source, especially when everyone is so used to a gasoline-powered vehicle or a diesel-powered vehicle, where the technology has been around for so long and always in your mind. It's when you come to a new technology, there's it's called the technology adoption curve, right? And every technology goes through the same curve, whether it be a television or a microwave or a refrigerator, right? It's like every new technology goes through this curve, and we're currently we're past the early adopter stage with electric vehicles, and it's becoming more mass market. So as it progresses, it becomes more and more widespread.
I bought a hybrid at the end of the year, and I got a wonderful check back from the feds with my taxes and from the state. That was part of the incentive because of the cost of the car.
Mm-hmm.
So are these incentives still going to happen? Are we done with incentives? And then Sonoma Clean Power sent me a charging station, which we had to install. It was $220, and they keep track of it separately, so I get actually a different bill that shows me how much I'm using, which is wonderful. I mean, I think these are all really great tools.
Yeah.
And I'm so surprised that it's all been happening so long, and I'm brand new at all this. But like you say, we're in a learning curve.
So I'll speak to all your points there. The federal rebate program, the full rebate for an battery electric vehicle is $7,500. A plug-in hybrid, I believe, is $3,500.
It's income based.
Yeah, income. There we go. That one's income based. So those start tapering down after the auto manufacturer has sold 200,000 units. So Tesla has already met that, and they're on the step-down program, which is a 5-year step-down from the full rebate to nothing. So 20% per year of a decrease in the rebate. The idea is that at that point we're, like I said, past that early adopter, and we're now mass market, right? It's an incentive to allow people to adopt this vehicle. So they will be around for a lot of manufacturers. Chevrolet will run out of theirs next with the Volt and the Volt. Ford is coming along with their EVs. Kia and Hyundai will be around for a long time. So you may see a shift in market forces as that rebate starts to run out in one auto manufacturer. You may see people buying other vehicles, and then it'll help the fleet sort of diversify as well. Right now it's, primarily Tesla, Chevrolet, and BMW, but everyone else has an equivalent, for the most part, electric vehicle on the market. So those are the big market ones. The Leaf, the ones that were early and had a lot of marketing money have been purchased. So those may drive the market forces to balance it out. And then as you're speaking to the charger, it makes total sense. You're probably getting a reduced rate on the EV charge, and so you have a separate meter. They'll come out and you can have it installed. It's pretty easy to split the meter. They'll come and read the meter twice. You'll be able to track your full kilowatt-hour usage for your electric vehicle. If you have solar, you have a third meter already, and you're putting that back on the grid. So in conjunction, all three of them together are really, really effective to reduce your actual energy cost. Here in California, an electric vehicle is more cost effective to own and drive than every available vehicle on the market except for the newest generation Toyota Prius. It has enough electric range that it is actually more cost effective to run on gasoline. But as far as emissions go, the EV is cleaner than all gasoline powered cars in California because our energy grid is so clean. It is not that way, say, in West Virginia or Washington, D.C., where owning an electric vehicle is actually worse for the environment than driving a fairly normal gasoline vehicle. So it's sort of a trade-off. Here in California, we're lucky that we have a grid that allows us to achieve those GHG emission reduction goals with EV.
I just wish there were more charging stations in Ukiah, which are planned.
There you go. Yeah.
That I could make it here and back on electricity.
Yep.
Thank you, Nick. We should probably move this along. I mean, clearly there's a lot more education needed, a whole class would be great. Did you have another thing to add, Scott?
Okay.
Yeah.
That if anybody, I didn't see it in the report, Point Arena has multiple charging stations that are owned by the city. I was curious why it didn't make the report, or did it, and it was just too low on the threshold to make your tables?
They're in the map. Yeah, we just, for that table, we just took the 3 largest cities. That was the
That's
only
fine.
reason.
And
But
I know
we're aware of the Point Arena charters.
I'm totally
They're,
used to it. Point Arena!
Yeah,
So,
they're being
but
counted.
I would invite anybody over here from the council or in the audience to come to Point Arena. If they have an electric vehicle, you can get a good charge there at the theater. And I know there's at least 2 Tesla stations going in town as well right now. So, thank you.
Yeah, I think part of that breakdown was because of the census data and the way they grouped that up, so that's how it ended up in the report. We're well aware of those Point Arena stations, thank you. Yeah, so, you know, there's a lot of education that's still needed, and, you know, these guys are just loaded with information, so it's great to have them as a resource today. I wanted to make a couple of comments. You know, this idea of having a coordinating council is something that is recommended by the governor's office. You know, they have their governor's office of business development. They've developed this guidebook for local governments on installing chargers and the standards and trying to streamline all that for you. And that's one of the things they really recommend is sharing best practices and kind of helping each other out. It's really necessary. So we would like to continue that effort and see if we can get that going. The major change, I would say, between the original plan that MCOG put together in 2013, also by W-Trans, and this one is that in the beginning, our concept was build that safety net by an existing public agency, and that's clearly not what's happening. That's hard to do. What is happening is, you know, businesses coming to town and they're putting in all these stations, and our local agencies are kind of in reaction mode to they're being, you know, asked to give out permits and things like that. So it's sort of the shoes on the other foot. And so we tried to build into the plan these public-private partnerships more. That's kind of the change of emphasis. So should we talk about accepting the plan?
Right. What we would recommend is that you would accept the plan, but direct staff to work with the consultant to finalize it before the end of June. We do have a few, since we received it, staff's gone through it, and we have a few minor comments, but they're minor, that we'd just like to work with the consultant to finalize it.
Okay, would also a motion just state the council agrees that, that we would, or staff anyway, would approach the super region and suggest that this would be an appropriate role for the super region to take on?
All right. And I would like to add an Appendix D, which is the 10 pages of 69 action items that came from the Northwest California Alternative Fuels Readiness Plan that we participated in, and just to kind of keep those alive and carry them forward in our plan just as reference material, things that can be done. So I think it would be good to have just that extra appendix there. It's those outcomes from that plan are just kind of summarized briefly.
And that would be appendix what, did you say?
Pardon me?
That was appendix what? Appendix?
We've got from the alternative fuels plan, I couldn't quite hear you there.
What's the appendix letter?
Oh, D.
D, okay, thank you.
Yeah, because there's an A, B, and a C right now, so we'd add a D.
Okay. Do we have any public comments on this?
Anyone else?
Okay.
Okay.
Not seeing any public
All right.
comments? Okay. Does someone want to make a motion?
I will recommend that we accept the zero-emission vehicle and alternative fuel readiness plan update and direct the consultant to work with UNCOG staff to incorporate any desired edits and finalize the plan by June 30, 2019,
Including appendix D?
including Appendix D as in David.
Seconded.
Okay, we got about 3 seconds there. I think Scott was the quickest on the draw there. Okay, got a motion. Probably roll call because Rex is on the phone.
Dr. Brown?
Yes.
Carter?
Yes?
Oschek?
Yes.
Ignacio?
Yes.
Alvin Smith?
Yes.
Jackman?
Yes.
And Judy?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Appreciate it.
That was very informative. I mean, it's interesting to learn more of the nuances about how the electric charging stations work.
And by the way, I have a EV that goes up to 250 miles, and I only charge it at home at night, so. Also can travel out of town.
Okay, thank you. And now we're on to the report and presentation for the pedestrian facilities need and inventory and engineered feasibility study prepared by trail people.
Okay, I'm going to fix that for you. I'm going to set up the next presentation.
Yes, while she's doing that, let me just give you the overview. As reported last month, the current work program also contains a carryover project to conduct the countywide pedestrian facilities needs inventory and engineered feasibility study. And the purpose of that project was to study the needs and priorities and identify deficiencies within the pedestrian networks for the 4 cities and the county. And that was consisted of 2 different components funded with different state funding sources. So the project was broken down into a South Coast and Greater Point Arena component and an Inland and North Coast component. It was conducted together for efficiency, and that project was awarded to Trail People after a competitive procurement process. So that project is also wrapping up at the end of the fiscal year, and the consultant team led by Trail People, Sophia Zander is here today to make that PowerPoint presentation. The draft report's been on the MCOG website for a good amount of time. There is one copy of the one hard copy circulating, there's one in the back for the public, and there's a very large appendix. So these, again, after the project is finalized, will be made to you, made available upon request. In addition, each city in the county will get a copy of this. The Technical Advisory Committee was very involved in identifying these projects and just giving input into the development of this plan. So I believe we're ready for the presentation from the consultant. And do you have anything that you want to add?
Just that some of these in the South Coast portion of the project you may recognize from our last MCOG tour.
Yes.
So Loretta will, as a city, will get one of these?
Yes, you will. Each city in the county.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. My name is Sophia Zander. I am a principal with Trail People, the prime consultant on this project. We were part of a team of consultants that worked on this, and my colleague Rourke Healy is here with me today. I just want to say it was really fast. Can you hear me? It was really fascinating listening to the EV presentation. I drove my plug-in electric minivan up here, but wasn't able to plug in when I got here, so I'm looking forward to the next time coming and plugging in. But I have used the chargers in Point Arena and really appreciated those. All right, let's see.
I recognize the photo too there, so.
Good.
That's a photo?
Yeah,
It's a heavily adapted photo.
Manchester.
Yeah. As Loretta mentioned, this project is a county-wide project, but was done in 2 parts. The Greater Point Arena South Coast area in the south, and then the Inland and North Coast area for the remainder. And we did it in 3 stages, and I'll go through this a little bit more in a second, but the overview is 2 parts, and then there were 3 stages. So there was the existing condition stage, then followed by a public input stage, and finally the project evaluation report stage, which we're just wrapping up. This is the overall schedule. I don't expect anyone here to digest all of it, but it's to show that the way that it worked in those stages, we ended up having the Point Arena South Coast portion go sooner. So originally everything was kind of going hand in hand, but the blue lines ended up getting shifted early and the green lines later to accommodate some funding requirements. It also enabled us to sort of use the South Coast and Point Arena area to find.
We lost Caltrans.
Okay. Hi, Caltrans.
If you need help, hang up and then dial your operator.
I had that moment of thinking my cell phone or something was happening. It also, so what I was saying is it allowed us to use the South Coast to fine tune that process so that when we got to the larger North Coast inland area, we had figured out a little bit of the process. And then also just to point out where we are, we're really close to the end here. We've been working on this since April of last year, and we're just wrapping up and finalizing the document after today. As I mentioned, this was done in two parts, in large part due to the funding sources. The Greater Point Arena South Coast component was funded by the State Rural Planning Assistance Funds, and the Inland and North Coast component had a Caltrans grant, which was matched by local transportation funds. The public participation process was a very robust process. We worked with LGC and Allison out of Laytonville, who was very, very knowledgeable of the communities in Mendocino, and we had several workshops, an online survey with an interactive map. We attended many local meetings, and Allison attended a few pop-up events. We also were receiving comments via email up until very recently, I believe. I can give you more detail on that, but there's more detail about the entire public participation process in the appendices. We also formed a technical advisory group, although Loretta, was it a committee? I always get confused if it was a group or a committee. Anyhow, the TAG met 5 times over the course of the project and was very involved. I believe for some of you on that, trying to see if there's recognizing faces. Anyhow.
It's the technical staff.
Okay, so that met 5 times and was very involved in the getting into the guts of how this project was put together. The report, as Loretta mentioned, is a large one, and I think there's at least one copy up there. It's 275 pages for the main part of the document, and that doesn't include the appendices. The first part of the document, the executive summary, is really it's like the first part that you're going to want to look at. It's got a summary of all the projects, but broken down by community and by tier, and we'll look at that at the end of this presentation. But that's really where you're going to go to say you look at your community and find out the top tier, middle tier, and the third tier of projects. The introduction section of the report is the part that explains how we got to that. It's the methodology, and it goes into some more details of all of the projects, even the projects that weren't in the end evaluated as a priority project. And then the third part of the report, which is the project details, and those are grouped by their location. So the Point Arena projects are together, the unincorporated South Coast projects are another area, and then each of the North Coast inland incorporated cities, those projects are together, and all the unincorporated North Coast communities are together. And I'll show you an example of one of those pages in a moment. There are 7 appendices. The first 4 were published as part of this as part of our process. So the existing conditions reports for North and South and the public input reports, those were each published independently and available independently early on in the process. The next 2, Appendix E and F, will provide the details on the costs and how we got to those costs for each project, and the evaluation and how we got to the specific evaluations for each project. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. The final appendix, Appendix G, is a list of potential funding resources. These are potential sources for actually moving these projects forward to completion. The project types that we identified. So, I must have missed a slide early on. We talked about the overall goal of this project was to look at projects throughout the county and rank them and order them so that moving forward, it's easy for the county and different agencies to pick a project to move forward when funds are available. We ended up ranking and going into detail on 68 projects in the county. However, we looked at more than double that number of what could be considered projects in the county. So we really went through with a fine-tooth comb all the existing plans and listened to all the public comments and came up with a really lengthy list of potential projects for improving pedestrian access in the community. So the 68 projects are ranked and listed in that introduction and in the meat of the document. The other projects, these are projects that, there are a lot of other projects that are not in those areas, but they are listed in this main table. And those are projects that are either already underway or so far funded and programmed that they're basically going to be happening soon, or so long-term that they weren't realistic to include in this, or they were projects that came up and seemed to be of importance in certain areas, but might be considered more recreational or peripheral, rather than more core pedestrian improvement projects. Again, those ones that are included for reference are included in the main part of the project, the document, but not in detail. They're at this kind of level that you see here, where they have a name and a location and some information about it. So as I mentioned, we had a pretty extensive criteria for deciding the rank of these projects. Once we sort of distilled it down to those 68 projects, we looked at a lot of factors to decide how they would rank against each other's. The meat of this ranking was based on a 100-point system that used the Caltrans Active Transportation Grant Program as a basis. We didn't follow those, the ATP grant criteria exactly. We adapted it for Mendocino specific situations, but the ATP is one of the main funding sources for pedestrian improvements in California. It's not to say it's the only funding source, but it is a big funding source. And so we were looking at what projects are going to be really competitive in that funding cycle, in the next ATP funding cycle. The three big areas that this that the ATP looks at is the need and potential use of a project, how much of a safety improvement this will be, and that is determined really based on how many collisions have happened in the vicinity of the project already. It's not the concern about future ones, it's what's already happened. And then the final area that we looked at was the cost and constructability. In this 100-point system, the TAG spent a lot of time with us working on really fine-tuning it and making it reflect the needs and desires of the Mendocino County communities specifically. As I mentioned, the biggest part of our report includes these details on each of the 68 recommended projects. So for each of those 68 projects, there is a little mini chapter that includes a detailed description, photos, detailed map and illustrations, a cost estimate, and details about the evaluation. So this is where you could go in the future and really find out what was the project that was being recommended there. Where the project was already recommended in another report, we used as much of that information as we could and carried that forward. Where it was a new project, we created new maps and diagrams. The cost estimate, a lot of information went into the cost estimate, but again, where there was already a project that had been recommended in another report, we used that cost estimate and factored in the passage of time since it was created. We looked at only the core pedestrian improvements. We weren't looking at a lot of the other surrounding issues that come up when you're constructing a project. We did factor in a lot of soft costs for things such as design, project administration, environmental review, and mitigations. But these are all planning level engineered estimates. So this is where we worked with our engineering sub-consultant to make sure that they were very realistic cost estimates, but realistic for a planning level document. And again, I should say that the evaluation criteria and the estimate information are in the appendices. We give a lot of detail about how we got to these numbers. So if you want to bore into those, we can do that with those appendices. Another factor that we used in looking at our core recommended projects was getting a good regional distribution. So we worked really hard with the TAG and with the staff to end up with a list that wasn't just ranking, say, a small rural community against Ukiah, so that there wasn't any one part of the county getting all the projects that were tier 1. So we first organized all the projects into regions. So we used the unincorporated versus incorporated, south and north, and then the 4 incorporated communities. And then within each of those areas, the projects are ranked into 3 tiers, and we'll talk about those in a minute. So this is the exciting, the meat of the report, right? This is where we get to look at each community and say, this is our tier 1, 2, and 3. This is our recommended project for each community. I'm gonna flip through all of these, and then I'm gonna open this up to comments, because I'm gonna assume that you will want to look at this a little bit longer there's no sense in me reading all these to you, but the areas, again, to show you, we looked at the Point Arena area priority projects, and again, there's tier 1, 2, and 3 projects, and those are shown on the map, the general location. And this is the information that's going to be in the executive summary. In the 3rd part of the report is where you have the detailed description of each project. For the unincorporated South Coast communities, there were only 4 projects in that area, so there was only 2 tiers there. In the Fort Bragg area, we again have tier 1, 2, and 3, and I want to note that in Fort Bragg, Willits, and Ukiah, there are projects that are included in the Fort Bragg list that are in unincorporated, the unincorporated area nearby, and those are noted in the table. As an example, so FB 17 in tier 2, the 4th project in tier 2, it notes that connection is in an unincorporated county. And here's Ukiah priority projects. Again, it includes a few unincorporated projects in the unincorporated area. And we have Willits. And this is the remaining, the other unincorporated North Coast and inland communities. So there's a lot there. And I know that went a little bit fast, but I wanted to get through the whole meat of it and then let us spend some time talking about what we have there and what we don't have, see what questions you have. Is there anything you wanted to add, Loretta?
I did want to emphasize that, one of the reasons behind this study is that with the ATP program, as Sophia said, that's one, if not the largest funding source for non-motorized projects, and specifically in this case, pedestrian projects. And agencies will be able to take this document and choose a priority project knowing that it's going to score well. And so we really want the agencies to use this, to come up with some good projects that most of the work's been done, at least as far as basic work. And they've been vetted through the public, and that's a requirement through the ATP program. So we feel it's a very valuable project. All the cities in the county served on the technical advisory committee, provided input into the projects, and the way the projects fell out is how they scored using that criteria. So you might look at something and think, well, why is that in the top tier? It's based on that criteria.
Oh.
No problem.
Add just one follow-up to what Loretta said. When the agencies are looking at how those projects scored, if there's a project that they feel is important that maybe didn't score well, that isn't necessarily an indication they should just drop that project, but it's an indication that they need to do something to change the nature of that project if they're going to pursue funding, so to improve its score.
And also to be clear, like I said, there are other sources of funding, right? So a project that's scored low as tier 3 here might not be so competitive for ATP, but might be very competitive for a different source.
Exactly.
And that's also why we included those other projects, because say, for example, one of those recreational projects might be really competitive for a more recreation-focused grant source. Yeah.
Go ahead.
When will the hard copies be available, and is there a digital that's going to be posted online for
Yes. So
accessibility?
once you accept it and we finalize it, we are not accepting any more comments from anyone, so they'll just change cover and call it final. And copies will be available as soon as possible, and it will be posted online. Each of the agencies will have a copy, and other than that, copies will be provided as requested.
And the draft is on, the draft
Draft
is online now.
Yeah, it's been
as
online
well.
for a while, yes.
I believe there's a link on the agenda, too. Okay.
Well, I was happy to see an item that I had suggested, which was actually relayed to me by a number of people over the years, but just there's a limited number of people who will sometimes show up to an evening, town hall meeting, was added to the list in level 2 was the North Fort Bragg Pedestrian project, which I think the narrative accurately describes it as trying to connect that Pudding Creek neighborhood, which is a relatively flat terrain and fairly highly populated, but they've got some linkage issues that doesn't make it terribly easy for them to get into town. And so I'm glad to see that's on the list.
Okay. I'm glad that got communicated.
Did anyone else have any comments? Do we have any public comments on the report? No? Does someone want to make a motion?
I'll move we accept the draft final pedestrian facility needs inventory and engineered feasibility study report.
I'll second.
Okay, thank you. Roll call?
Okay. Brown?
Yes.
Stransky?
Yes.
Carter?
Yes.
Huston?
Yes.
Ignacio?
Yes?
Alvin Smith?
Yes.
Jackman?
Yes.
And Judy?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure working with the county.
I hope it goes well.
Thank you.
Okay, then we have the Technical Advisory Committee's recommendations of May 22nd, 2019, adoption of a final 1920 planning overall work program, as well as allocation of additional regional surface transportation partnership program funds for the Covelo State Route 162 multimodal path, and programming and award of highway infrastructure funds to the City of Ukiah's downtown streetscape project.
Yeah, so we'll take all of those individually.
Okay.
Yes. Okay, so number 7A is adoption of the proposed final work program for next fiscal year 1920. So you have the final work program in your board packet, and I've reported to you periodically, I believe, over the last few months on the progress. And at last month's May budget workshop, I gave you a report on the projects that are included. So since that report, we've added 3 carryover projects requested by agencies, and they're listed on my staff report. Ukiah is adding their carryover project for an ADA access plan. The county is adding a carryover project for the Orchard Avenue Extension Feasibility Study grant match. And Fort Bragg is carrying over their transportation planning for the mill site reuse and rezoning project. So what you have before you, the final, includes the draft that you've heard about before, the additional carryover projects. We've also since learned, since our last meeting, that our submitted grant projects both were awarded by Caltrans, so we're happy to report that. So we've changed them from, in the draft, they had said requested, now they say awarded in the final. And let's see, the only other minor item, we had a teleconference this morning with Caltrans on the award of the Work Element 8, the Fire Vulnerability Assessment Emergency Preparedness Grant. And during that discussion, they wanted to make sure that we add Caltrans District 1 and Caltrans headquarter representatives to the Technical Advisory Committee that will be working on this large countywide fire vulnerability project. And so we are going to add just to task 2.2, which lists the makeup of the Technical Advisory Committee, just to make sure we add Caltrans District 1 and Caltrans headquarters to that group. So that's the only minor addition to what you have in front of you, and I would be happy to answer any questions. Or please include that minor addition in your motion.
I would just add that I think there's a lot of interest around the whole county in
Yes.
that fire safety plan.
Right.
Yes.
Do you want to say anything? Ben?
So you'll probably be fielding phone calls next year or so as people are interested in that plan.
That will kick off after July 1.
Okay, thank you. Does someone want to make a motion?
I move that we adopt the fiscal year 2019-20 final overall work program.
I'll second.
And that's with the amendment adding Caltrans District 1 and Caltrans headquarters to the TAC.
Thank you.
Yes.
All right, a roll call?
Brown,
Yes.
Stransky,
Yes.
Carter,
Yes.
Haschek,
Yes.
Ignacio,
Yes.
Jackman,
Yes.
and Jurdy.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, now we're on to the allocation of partnership funds for the state route, the Copelo Corridor Multimodal Trail, not to exceed $200,000.
Yes, so I think most of you are familiar with the project, the Active Transportation Program funded project in Covelo that MCOG is implementing. It's along parallels 162 to provide a pedestrian and bicycle facility separate from the highway through a stretch that is very dangerous, has very high pedestrian fatality rate. So when the application was originally submitted for the Active Transportation Program in 2014, the MCOG board approved $250,000 from the RSTP Partnership Program funding for the project. And we are now at a point where we've had increased costs, and so we are requesting an additional $200,000 at this time, and James will talk about some of the details behind that increase. But just to give you an idea of the funding that's available from that program, this is the funding source that $100,000 goes into each year from the annual RSTP apportionment to the region before it's given out to cities and counties. There is $811,515 currently available for allocation. In the staff report is a listing of some of the projects that the funding has previously been awarded for, such as the Branscombe Road Pedestrian Bridge, the electric vehicle charging stations in Fort Bragg, Point Arena, and Willits, the Simpson Lane Roundabout, and then a couple of different projects in the North State area for the county. So that I'll let James talk about more project details.
She pretty much covered the entire thing except for why we need some more money. So in doing the initial environmental work, there's a lot of wetland area up there, and there are a lot of old oak trees. And so the environmental document and the permitting agencies are requiring that we do a lot of wetland mitigation, not as much as the bypass, but a lot more than we originally had planned for, as well as planting a bunch of new oak trees. And there's also an endangered plant. Well, they believe there's seeds buried in the dirt that may or may not propagate, and so Caltrans is requiring that, well, not Caltrans, sorry, Fish and Wildlife is requiring that we disturb the ground to try to get the seeds to propagate. And so we had to do some planning for that as well, and there's going to be some mitigation for that as we move forward with the process. And then part of this funding that we're asking for will be for the plant propagation. There's upwards of 4,000 plants that need to get propagated as part of the mitigation for the wetlands as well as the oak trees. Any questions?
What are those seeds that are?
It's Milo Baker's lupin.
Mm-hmm.
So there's 5 noted seed areas where they believe the seeds may be, and so Caltrans is having to do their own project up there as well with this, and so we're trying to dovetail on it. But they want us to come and dig up the dirt and see what happens, and then come again the following year and dig up the dirt and see what happens. So Apparently it's
What
pretty
if they all
full.
come back, that they can still dig up the dirt?
Then we don't touch it, if they come back.
Is this a mitigated thing also?
It's part of the permitting process. In the environmental document, we noted that, you know, there is the possibility that the plant was located in the region. They did some studies, didn't find any plants. And then Fish and Wildlife came back and said, well, even though there's no plants, the seeds can stay underground and stay dormant for decades. And so you have to go and figure out if they actually are there or not.
You have one of those mitigated things, and it's a lifetime.
Yeah.
Okay, do we have any public comments on this agenda item?
I would make a motion to accept the recommendation of the staff.
Okay.
Second.
Okay, got a motion and a second. I guess roll call?
Brown?
Yes.
Stransky?
Yes.
Carter?
Yes.
Housechek?
Yes.
Ignacio?
Yes.
Jackman?
Yes.
And Jurdy.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, now we're on to programming and award of highway infrastructure funds for the City of Ukiah's downtown streetscape project.
Yes, so the Highway Infrastructure Program funding, this is a new funding source. It comes from the Federal Transportation Bill. 2 years of funding were made available through that bill. Whether or not this funding source continues depends on the next transportation bill. So at this time, we're just considering it a one-time funding source, but spread out over 2 years. So the funds are for construction or reconstruction of streets, roads, and highways. They have to be used on facilities of a certain functional classification, so anything above a rural minor collector, which in this rural area kind of limits the facilities that it can be used on. The funding is spread into 2 years. And totals, I have the total in here. $548,913. It has to be allocated, the first year of funding has to be allocated by September 30th, 2021. The second year has to be allocated by September 30th, 2022. And then there are a few years beyond that whatever agency receives the funding has to actually expend those funds. So this funding source was discussed with the Technical Advisory Committee at 2 different meetings. We talked about the general possibilities for using it either on an existing federal project because the funds are federal. You don't want to add federal funds to a non-federally funded project because it changes the requirements, or open up the funding to a new project, but because of the timeline involved, a new project that would be, simple to move through the project development components. So the Technical Advisory Committee at their May meeting decided that the best use for the funds at this time would be to supplement the City of Ukiah's downtown streetscape project. It is an existing project that has federal funding already through the HSIP program, which is the Highway Safety Improvement Program. And it is far along in development. They're in the final design phase currently, and anticipating awarding a contract this fall. So the TAC recommended that the funding be awarded for the city's project. There was some concern discussed at the TAC level about, there's been some public concern about the city project, and then just overall costs. And so the TAC included in their recommendation that if the city does not move forward with the project, that the funding would go back to the TAC for another recommendation. So the STIP portion, the STIP portion of the funding, which was awarded by MCOG, that will go to the California Transportation Commission for an allocation at the end of June. June 27th is the meeting date. And if the city moves forward with that allocation at that time, that's the indication that they'll be moving forward with the project. If for some reason they don't, then the funding would come back to the TAC for reconsideration. So if the board approves this action, then staff will process an amendment of the Federal State Transportation Improvement Program that programs those funds. And then once that's done, the city will be able to access the funding. City staff is here to answer any questions about the project, and MCOG can answer questions as well.
Any timeline on that, on the project, Rick?
Good afternoon, MCOG Board. I'm Rick Senor, Deputy Director of Public Works for City of Ukiah. And as Nafili had mentioned, we're moving full steam on our project, and we hope to be able to advertise for bids later on this fall with the start of construction right around after the first of the year. And this is, when I first heard about this at the tech meeting 2 months ago, back in April, I thought, well, this is just a fantastic opportunity, because our best intention of estimating the project when we applied for the funding several years ago wasn't good enough. You want to ask for the right amount of funding, and you don't want to be short, but it never fails. You kind of end up short. So it's a good opportunity to gain some extra funding.
Thanks.
Yes, you've had some community meetings about this.
Yes.
Yes. And what's the community feel about it? Is it positive?
I think generally it's been positive. I was at the first meeting. I was out of town at the second one. The first meeting we had recently, in the 2nd of May, I believe, it was with the business, just specifically business community, and they had some questions. And from what I understand, we had a good turnout at the second meeting, although I wasn't there, and there were a lot of questions. And I think there's just, people have a lot of skepticism about changing, and understanding how we can allow the same amount of volume of traffic to flow on 3 lanes, one south, one north, and then the turn lanes in between, compared to the existing 2 lanes of traffic. So it was just a good opportunity for people to hear those answers and responses from our consultant team directly. So I think we've been able to answer the questions. So it's definitely, it requires change from everyone. But I think overall it's going to be a great project once we're finished construction.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to maybe add to that a little bit. It definitely was a tough sell. This project's been on the books for a very long time, and right now it's far along in the design phase. Even though it was a tough sell in the beginning, I think that there's a lot of the anxious people are now seeing that yes, it can be done. It can be successful. It's been successful in other jurisdictions. The safety it'll provide along a major portion of State Street is something that just has to happen. It's an unsafe street, the way I look at it right now. So, I would say there's still those naysayers, but overall, I say 95% of the people are accepting of it now. Where it started is really good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was at a city council meeting a couple months ago, and it was when they awarded the contract for the design, the final design, and there were people there that expressed, members of the public that expressed concern, but there were also a lot of members of the public there to express support. And I think some of the concerns that were expressed, the city and the consultants have been able to successfully address and alleviate some of those concerns. So I think overall it's positive for the city.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Not seeing any other public comment. Does someone want to make a motion?
I make a motion to approve the programming of the available HIP funding for the City of Ukiah's downtown streetscape project as
Second.
presented.
Yeah. And there's a second. Okay, roll call.
Thank you. Brown?
Yes.
Stransky?
Yes.
Carter?
Yes.
Huschek?
Yes.
Ignacio?
Yes.
Jackman?
Yes.
And Jurdy?
Yes.
Thank you.
Right. And I'll just add that if it appears that this funding source will continue, we'll probably look to develop some kind of ongoing procedures for awarding the funding rather than treating it as one-time funding.
Yeah, because it's interesting because I had in my mind that HIP funds normally went to Caltrans and that agencies could ask Caltrans directly for HIP funds, but is this sort of a new occurrence for a portion of the HIP funds to go through the COG?
So my understanding, and which is limited, and even the people at headquarters, at Caltrans headquarters, seem to be unfamiliar with this program. But so it was 5-year, or for the first 3 years of this funding source, it went directly to the states, and it was not apportioned to regions. I don't know what it was used for at that time, but then there were 2 years of direct apportionments to regions. So that may be why you've heard of it, but it's never been a local issue previously.
Yeah, I could be remembering incorrectly, but I thought I remembered years ago Dave Goebel getting some HIP funds, but through Caltrans District 1. But maybe I'm not remembering that correctly.
That could be. I don't know. It also, I wonder, it wasn't HSIP, it was HIP. There are a lot of acronyms that sound the same.
I know it wasn't shop funds anyway, so okay.
Okay.
All right, well, thanks.
If you can repeat the question, I might know the answer, but I might not. I just missed a couple of the key acronyms, I think.
Well, I think essentially the question was, did the HIP funding exist prior to this current federal transportation bill, or is this a newer source of funding?
My guess would be that it didn't, because unless they changed the name, it's not familiar to me from the past.
Okay.
Okay.
But you know, a lot of existing programs have been combined and you know, mixed and matched with the current funding program.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. So,
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't have a definitive answer.
okay, well, that takes us to item 8, which is fiscal year 1920 Regional Transportation Planning Agency budget.
I'll take that one. So you've got this document either electronically or in print form. That's our budget package with all the resos. We covered most of this last month, so I thought I would just go over the things that have changed since then. So you've had that presentation. We've got recommendations from all the committees, and everything is documented now in this budget package. So just to summarize, the total revenues in the budget are $8,548,287, and that's down 20,000 from what I told you in my written staff report here. I found some money, Nafili and I caught, there was 20,000 that got allocated previously. So that is the new figure. And the total proposed allocations are $7,700,959. So since you last saw this, we have added funds to the planning program, and you've just finished approving that planning work program. So that's got added in all the carryover projects and funding awards, this kind of thing. So we do expect a little more. Loretta probably already mention that with one of the funding sources, we have to wait till after the close of the year. This will come back to you again for an amendment of the planning program in August, most likely. We usually have an amendment pretty early in the fiscal year. So that new total for planning program is $989,346. Okay, moving on. We have documented the unmet transit needs. The Transit Productivity Committee met during May, as did the Social Services Transportation Advisory Council. So you have those two committees' input. They concurred on the same recommendation of 3 needs found reasonable to me. And I'm sorry, I see a typo in my written report. It says written out 3, but the numeral 5, it's meant to be 3. All right. And they found 3 needs that were reasonable to meet in the list that came in as testimony in last December. And we're not adding new money. Those are anticipated to make use of existing resources. No additional funding is recommended. MTA did not claim any funds. So I could probably point you to where these things fall in the budget. If you have the print copy, there are some blue dividers between each of the resolutions. And if you don't have the print copy, they're divided by first administration by competitive planning. That's all MCOG's programs that we do. Then it goes to the unmet transit needs with that finding. And that's all documented here. And then after that, the MTA allocation, a resolution for that with the findings. I'll review that briefly. And then lastly, the Regional Surface Transportation Program funds, which I should say you just took an action now to allocate $200,000 from the Partnership Funding Program. And anticipating that action, that's documented already here in this budget. So, so you have the unmet needs. The transit allocation is in here. We've made the necessary, we've collected all the data that we need to make the findings that are documented in this resolution. There are a lot of findings that need to be made according to the Transportation Development Act. That's what all this narrative is here in the resolution. So we had to make findings about the productivity, eligibility for funding. There's a lot of things that we have to check off. I've got all that on file in the office, or we'll have the last couple items I need before the new fiscal year starts. They're adopting, MTA adopts their budget in June, so I need to get their budget, their capital plan. And the last one is the Regional Service Transportation Program. And since I saw you last, I believe we added the $200,000 of carryover for that Colo Trail project you just spoke about a few minutes ago. And that's an estimate. We don't have new grant funds this coming year. We won't be ready for them. There's over $3 million awarded for that project by the California Transportation Commission. It's coming in pieces as the project is ready for it, as phases are completed. So we don't expect any more grants in the new year, but we do have some carryover, a couple $100,000, and then we've also added this supplemental allocation of $200,000 you just made earlier in this meeting. So far, there's been no action taken on this, and I would be happy to take any questions about any of this material if you'd like. Other than that, we can ask you to approve these resolutions individually, or you could do them all in one motion, as you wish. Any questions? I'm gonna turn off this phone that's beeping at me. Okay.
Yeah, hi Janet. With the unmet transit needs, that I'm looking at it on the report here, and I can't find where the 3 are listed.
Where to find them?
Yes.
Okay. So are you looking at your computer there?
Yeah.
All right, so let's see. I don't have page numbering on that. It's the second resolution, and it's after
Okay.
a divider number 2.
It's in the hard copy, and I see it there.
Do you want to look at the, oh, do you have a hard copy to look at? You can share over there? Okay.
Yeah.
So the 3 needs found reasonable to meet were all came out of MTA's public board meetings when they took input from the general public at those meetings. So those 3 are to add a bus stop on East Gobi Street at a senior mobile home park, that's here in Ukiah. The second one is to add more service on Talmadge Road for those who cannot walk very far, so it's for pedestrians needing to get a ride on Talmadge Road. That's here in Ukiah Valley as well. And the final one was to reconsider a pulse system at the Navarro Junction for buses to Fort Bragg, Ukiah, Wolala, and Point Arena. So MTA has 3 routes that come together at the Navarro River Junction on Route 1. So they're talking about, as I understand, a pulse system means the buses arrive there all at one time so that passengers can transfer to a different route and extend their trip. So those were the 3.
Okay.
And they believe, MTA thinks that they can accomplish these things by timing their routes. They've got to kind of reorganize when those buses run, or they can meet these through their dial-a-ride service and their mobility management program. So they think they can figure that out internally and get those things to work without more funds. So that's kind of why we go through this process, to see what rises to the top and what can possibly be done with limited funding. So that is the recommendation. Anything else on that?
I'm not taking any other questions.
No, that's good.
On the unmet transit
Okay.
needs, are there any other questions on the LTF, local transportation funds? Carryover capital reserve funds?
Capital
not-
reserve funds. You know, MTA did not claim any capital reserve in the current year, but they would like to reserve, they're allowed to reserve up to 5 years, that fund. We can keep a fund for them for a 5-year period, but they need to identify the projects they want to use that money for in their 5-year capital plan. So that's the one thing I'm waiting for from MTA when they approve that budget. I'm trying to look for the, oh, okay. There is a table in this resolution that's kind of a synopsis of all the funds. So there's 674,000, almost 675,000 in that capital reserve fund that can be used over 5 years. And they've got several things going on. You know, they replace vehicles. They're working on, well, I'm sure some of you directors know a lot more about what they're doing with their capital. Chair Jurdig, I think they're working on improving the administration building, things like that.
Yeah, but I'm not really prepared to talk about the MTA budget, so.
Yeah. So there's a lot of material in here. It's really the culmination of several months of deliberations and pulling all the pieces and moving parts together and documenting that in one place here.
So you think it's okay to take all these in one motion?
We can do that. We've done it before. We'll just approve that whole budget and all the findings.
So I will move that the staff, we recommend that approve the 1920 RTPA budget by adopting the 4 resolutions for execution by the chair.
I'll second it.
And if I could ask another question.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, with the multi-purpose trail in Round Valley,
Yeah.
and the $3 million that's been committed in grants, and it's considered a multi-year project.
Yes.
Is there any idea when it might be completed, or?
I think we've requested an extension. Is James still here? I'd like him to speak to that.
Because people are asking me that when I
Yeah, we
go
hear
up
a
to
lot about
Covelo. Yeah,
We've had a couple more fatalities since this all started.
yeah.
It's a very, very crucial project.
So construction funding was slated for 1920, and I've asked for an extension because right now we're in the middle, or sort of the beginning of the right-of-way process. You know, design's almost done, and they're working on, they're getting ready to do the appraisals now. But we'd rather ask for an extension than be behind the 8 ball when it comes to right-of-way, because right-of-way could be a complicated process and take long. It's not a guaranteed like X amount of months and we'll be done. Some people may or may not like the appraisals they get, and you know, it's safer to just have extra amount of time to get that done. So with that in mind, we're hoping to get to construction by spring of 21. So it was slated to go to construction in spring of 20. It is possible. I'm not going to say it's not possible, but probably spring of 21 instead. So
Would it be completed that construction season?
yeah, and it's, I mean, it's a fairly simple project. It's just long, and so it's just a trail and then a bridge, and the bridge is all prefabricated. So they're just gonna pour the piers and drop it on it. So.
Okay, thank you.
Have you ever talked to anybody from up there that we have a person on our staff that was raised in Covelo, and I might have told this story before, but it's interesting. He grew up in Covelo, and his mother did not want him to walk the road. There was a herd of cattle that was back up to their story, and she would go out in her apron and flap her apron to pull all the bulls and the cattle to her. He would run across that to the health center, and then he had a signal that she would do that again when he came back, and that's a fact. And he says that, and it's unbelievable to me that you have to do that. I mean, to raise a child is something else, but to have to go out and, you know, move the cattle around is bigger than that, I think. It's, you know, I can't understand this. I was up at the original meeting of this with Phil and all of us when we went to Covelo. I couldn't see anything wrong with it then, and to be this many years into it and just having it get final approval is amazing to me.
Unfortunately, that is the speed that things move in the transportation world, particularly when you're building something in an area that has biological resources and cultural resources. It just takes longer to get through project development, and then right of way is just because, you know, it's a lot of negotiation. Right away is sort of an unknown factor, and that's why we want to make sure that we give ourselves enough time. But you're absolutely right. You know, we wish that we could have this thing done now, because it's critical. And if it were that, you know, if moms didn't want their kids walking on the street at that time, you know, just imagine now with, you know, vehicles that are driving faster, and it's the conditions certainly haven't improved. So we are doing everything that we can to keep moving forward on this, but it does unfortunately take time.
And another question is, what happened to the 2 jurisdictions that thought that we were getting too many projects that we had a couple of months ago? Whatever happened with that?
So I was going to report on that under staff reports, but that was SB 152, and it has been held in committee, and what we have been told told by Senator Bell's staff is that they do not plan to reintroduce it this year. So we think for now it is dead. That doesn't mean it couldn't come back again next year, but for now it's dead. And they got a lot of feedback, not just from MCOG, but a lot of other rural organizations all around the state.
They should have.
So that was some good news.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we did have we had a second. I'm not sure who. We had 2 seconds at the same time. I think it's Michael seconded it.
There's a motion on the table, yeah.
It was.
I did.
Oh, I think. Yeah.
Okay, so
Roll call.
roll
I
call?
think.
Okay, Brown?
Yes.
Stransky?
Yes.
Carter?
Yes.
Hascheck?
Yes.
Ignacio?
Yes.
Jackman?
Yes.
And Judy?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, now we're on to Transit Productivity Committee recommendations of May 2nd, 2019. Approved resolution 2019 adopting a fare box standard of 10%, consistent with the minimum state requirement for non-urban transit operators.
Okay.
I'm kind of surprised we're not seeing MTA here for this item. This is like a huge deal because I think that the fare box ratio up until now has been 17%, the remaining coming from the sales tax, and now it's going down to 10%.
15 is what we
15.
had here. Yeah. Well, the problem was in that same Transportation Development Act TDA law, MTA's fare box requirement was grandfathered in from the 1970s at 14.7, much higher rate. And MCOG adopts its own performance standards. They're not so much legal standards as productivity goals. And so they have been very difficult to meet. That 15% and 12% for the senior centers is, particularly the 15% for MTA services has been difficult to meet. They don't always reach that. And in committee, we've had a lot of talk about this last few years. And part of the problem is MTA is trying to meet that standard and raising fares, the price of bus tickets, and that's been a disincentive to ridership. The ridership's been falling, and so those things don't go well together. So currently the only legal requirement is the 10% from the state. So the consensus was, and the recommendation out of your committee was to reduce MCOG's adopted standard to 10%, consistent with the new state law that passed a couple of years ago.
Do we have any questions, John?
No, I'm just ready to make a motion.
Great.
Okay. People are ready for that?
Okay, so I move that we approve the change of the fare box ratio down to 10% for MTA.
I'll second.
Okay. Do we need any public comment on this one? No. Okay, roll call.
Brown?
Yes.
Stransky?
Yes.
Carter?
Yes.
Hascheck?
Yes.
Ignacio?
Yes.
Jackman?
Yes.
And Judy?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, now we're on the consent calendar, which is approval of the May 6, 2019 minutes, adoption of resolution approving the programming of FTA intercity bus program funds to MTA, continuation of Route 65 service, and appointments to Social Services Transportation Advisory Council. Do we have a motion to approve the consent calendar?
So moved.
Second it.
Okay.
Can I ask which one? Brown?
Mr.
So-
Carter. Also move.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Brown?
Alright.
Yes.
Does need-
Stransky?
Yes.
Carter?
Yes.
Hascheck?
Yes.
Ignacio? Jackman?
Yes.
And Judy?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, now we're going to recess as the Policy Advisory Committee, reconvene as the Regional Transportation Planning Agency. Do we have a motion to ratify the actions of the Policy Advisory Committee?
I will move that we ratify those actions.
Second.
Okay. Not seeing any public comment. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? No. Okay, now we're on to reports. We've just taken care of a bunch of MTA business. I don't think we have to go into that. Loretta, is there anything to report on North Coast Rail Authority?
They canceled their May meeting for now.
Okay. MCOG staff, we have your summary of meetings. Is there anything you want to highlight?
Can I just make one correction?
Okay.
The third from the bottom, the meeting, the Prop 68 meeting was a webcast. It was not in Sacramento.
Okay, all right.
All right. Yeah, I have a couple more things that I wanted to mention under admin report. So I'd already reported on SB 152, the bill to change the active transportation program, so that is not moving forward at this time, which is very good news. Another bill that is moving forward but has been amended, it is SB 127. This was the proposal to change the SHOP, the State Highway Operation and Protection Program, to require inclusion of active transportation projects with all SHOP projects. It has been amended to only require those types of projects when appropriate, and what it's considering appropriate is places where state highways are main streets, so where they're serving more as part of the local circulation system rather than expressways. So that is, I think, a positive change for that bill, and it is moving forward at this point. And then just one other item, which I know Tess went to the CalCog meeting last week, and so she probably heard something about this, but there is a proposal in the budget trailer bill to award COGS funding for housing-related planning, for implementing the 6-cycle regional housing needs assessment, and that would be money that comes to COGS for award to local agencies. There's not a lot of detail on that at this point, but it could be up to $410,000 for the Mendocino County region. So we should be learning more about that in the next couple of months.
So when you say learning more about it, learning more as to what it is supposed to fund?
What it would fund, if it will, there's some debate still about whether it will actually, whether it would come to, for the rural COGS that do their own RENA, because some of them don't do their own RENA, the state does it for them. There's some question as to whether they would get their own pot of money or whether the state would manage that, and then the local agencies would apply directly to the state. So that hasn't been finalized yet.
So your understanding is it's for funding of planning revolving around the RENA numbers, or for other planning activities relating to housing?
Well, implementing RENA, but anything that creates additional, potential for creating additional housing, I think could be considered implementing RENA.
Okay, so if some agencies needed to rezone some land in order to enable housing, maybe it could potentially cover part of the cost of that rezone, or?
That is my understanding.
Okay.
But we'll learn more, and I'll report more as I have more information on that.
Okay, thanks.
So RENA is Regional Housing Needs Assessment, so any of you wondering.
Any other staff verbal reports?
Anything else from planning?
Nope.
You guys are busy on the budget.
Well, we will be recruiting here in the office. We have a couple positions open, so.
Under director report, I'll just mention something, and I know we're planning for transportation-related projects, but there is a trail project that could potentially move forward with funding unrelated to MCOG, but I just put it out there because I think it's interesting. Sinkiyou State Park, northern Mendocino County, Lost Coast, fairly inaccessible. You get to it from two either from the south from a funky county road, or you get to the north from a really, really funky county road. And so there's a trail meeting, not this week, but next week. Quite a few people are going to be there. I'm going to be there, looking at a trail that would run from Piercy right off State Highway 101 on flat land where a railroad once ran west till you reach Sinkione State Park. And it's about 12 miles on flat terrain. So if that idea is developed further and there's recreational trail funding available, which would, again, not be MCOG funding, I think it could be a great gateway for people who don't drive a four-wheel drive vehicle and want to explore the Lost Coast at Sinkione State Park, because finally there'd be an easy, convenient way to get to it. So anyway, just thought that was interesting.
So are they pursuing grant for construction at this point, or is it still just sort of in conceptual phases?
I think it's just a conceptual phase. The principal owner wants the trail, so I don't think it's so much of there may be little pieces that have to be acquired, but I don't think it's much of an acquisition project at this point, to my knowledge.
I wonder the Prop 68. So there are a couple of grants coming out of Prop 68, which the TAC members have all been given the information.
But the due dates are soon. One of the due dates is the end of June. You have to submit your project proposal. The other one's the end of August. So
Okay.
So yeah, maybe mention that. And I think one of them is you submit a simplified proposal, and then if it's selected, then you do a more detailed application.
Okay. Right.
Both of them? All right.
So that's due in August?
One in June and one in
So if you
August.
had any links and you wanted to
So
email
we
me
could
the links,
send-
that'd be
yeah.
appreciated. Okay. Any other director reports? Okay, all right, looks like we're ready for adjournment. Well, I guess we'll adjourn at 3:45.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
See you next time.
Oh, yeah, that's,
Yeah.
No July.
no.